Analog horror at 476 MHz. This is the phrase that stimulated an entire internet horror subgenre, originating from the grandfather of it all, Local58 by Kris Straub. If you're like me, you remember those nights. Lights off in your room, cuddled up in bed, watching unknown horrors beyond comprehension unfold right on your very own phone. It was a complete revolution in horror presentation that has since spawned a massive wave of inspired creators, with its influence still rippling throughout horror landscapes over 7 years later. Today, I want to take a look back at what exactly made this series and its mystery so utterly compelling, analyzing both its story and its tropes to see how it would affect the genre it created. Come with me now, as we take a comprehensive deep dive into everything Local58 has to offer. Don't worry, if you are afraid, we will look together. The first entry in this legendary series is titled "You Are on the Fastest Available Route." It begins with a classic schedule bumper. Strangely enough, though, the text for the paid programming bracket gets backspaced, deleted, until nothing is left. Then the channel cuts to dashcam footage. Time and date, around 1:58 AM on November 21st, 2014. We can likely assume that this is meant to be live, since the timing is so similar to the scheduled block that seemingly was just replaced. The automatic GPS voice says that the driver will arrive at their destination in
2 hours and 28 minutes,
which would be around 4:25 in the morning. Once the driver gets on the main road, the voice says,
"You are on the fastest available route."
The voice on the GPS says there's traffic ahead and the driver is rerouted.
Traffic ahead, rerouting.
This is strange because, aside from maybe construction, traffic is about the last thing you'd expect on a 3 AM road trip. Either way, the driver persists forward. The feed glitches once again, and we cut forward by a little over an hour. Noticeably, they have transitioned onto an unlit country back road with nobody around them anymore. The voice claims they will arrive at their destination in 14 minutes, but then we jump forward again, which is 27 minutes later, and they have not arrived at their destination. In fact, the GPS voice says this:
"Rerouting. Make a U-turn."
It seems rather unlikely that this was their intended destination. Something isn't right. The GPS tells the driver to follow signs for "do not enter," and then says something impossible.
"Continue on unnamed road. Then, in 300 feet, turn off your headlights."
The driver, obedient, does what they're told, stopping the vehicle and turning off the headlights. But then...
"Rerouting. Make a U-turn. Your destination is behind you. Rerouting. In 500 feet. Your destination will be on in 300 feet. Your destination in 250 feet. Rerouting. Your destination will be in 50 feet. You will arrive at your destination." You have arrived.
Where do we even start? Okay, it's hard to say exactly what happened here, but here's what we do know. This odd dashcam footage aired on the channel Local58, seemingly live for anyone to see, and clearly not intended by the station itself. Though we know nothing of the person or their intended destination, they were most definitely influenced by some outside force to detour from their route, and the GPS also said things it certainly was not programmed to say. All of this, of course, culminated in the appearance of this strange creature on the road, roaring at the driver and chasing them at speeds that surpassed the vehicle when they attempted to escape. And for now, that's pretty much all we know. Now, as I alluded to in the introduction, on top of the standard analysis, for this particular video I want to dedicate time to talking about the tropes that Local58 established and how it's affected analog horror as a genre over the years. In this instance, we can clearly see it at play, even just in the first entry, since the use of dashcam footage became an extremely popular way to frame narratives within these types of media. Obviously, this can be traced back to No Through Road and even further if you want to, but it's interesting to see how effectively it was used here with what was pretty much stock footage and sounds. The way that the episode is written and structured also went on to influence the genre. A seemingly mundane, normal subject or task deteriorates until hitting a climax with a scary payoff and ends with something bad happening as a result. Now, obviously, this is kind of just horror writing. It's not necessarily unique to Local58, but it's still a source through which many creators looked for inspiration when they decided to make their own series. And believe me, this is not the last that we'll see of the series having roots that extend far beyond its initial reach. But in order to unpack that, we'll have to continue to the next entry, Contingency. Contingency begins with an immediately older aesthetic, both in the quality of its recording and the channel branding. Just like last time, we see a schedule bumper showing that the channel's just about to wrap up the broadcast day at 3 in the morning. But since nothing can ever go the way it's supposed to, the goodnight screen gets interrupted and a logo appears, the U.S. Department for the Preservation of American Dignity. It's labeled Contingency Message Reel, not intended for use after November 13th, 1970. To be used only in the event of United States complete surrender to insurmountable enemy forces. The actual content of this message goes on to describe the loss of the American government to a foreign power and calls all citizens to act to preserve the memory of the United States clear and bright, untarnished and uncompromised. The next paragraph addresses the viewers with the pronoun I, implying the President himself has already, quote-unquote, taken action. The passage finishes with a strong closing statement. Let our united resolve echo through history. Even in defeat, we refused to yield. Even in defeat, we claim victory. And at the very bottom, this is signed by former President Lyndon B. Johnson. Even into the next section, the language used continues to be vague. Honor liberty by taking the final and greatest liberty of all. It is a privilege to be called to action. You take America with you. It's the government's attempt at a national mass suicide. The following slides instruct viewers how best to do the deed, recommending access to a loaded firearm and reassuring citizens they will join their neighbors, their family, and their God. Then we discover that you'd be probably shot dead regardless if you refuse to comply. At the bottom of the frame is possibly the most bone-chilling statement in the entire series. This message will repeat until there are none to read it. Continuing to hammer it in, it also encourages assuming a victory position. Front lawn, face up, feet together. The worst part's yet to come, honestly, with the next slide coercing loving parents into murdering their own children and pets in compliance. Infants and pets, the smallest patriots. Finally, the feed distorts and we briefly see a department logo and a chilling message. The 51st state is not a place. After that, the contingency tape concludes. We return to a Local58 bumper claiming technical difficulties and apologizing for the interruption. Then we see a new frame, a correction put out by the channel. But in the background, we see something else, which then appears briefly at the very end. It's titled Local58 Hoax Apology Card. The do not use date pushes all the way to May 14th, 1975, which, funnily enough, is the exact day I'm writing this part of the script. I thought that was a funny coincidence. Anyways, let's start the analysis of this entry with a question. When exactly does this episode take place? Well, we can break this question down further into two distinct parts, when the broadcast takes place and when the reel was created. We have a few hints as to when the broadcast takes place, the first of which being quite subtle, but just before the broadcast gets interrupted at the beginning, the goodbye screen shows a picture of an astronaut on the moon beside an American flag. Now, the moon landing doesn't occur until July 20th, 1969, so it had to have been at least past that date. I would say the channel's aesthetic lends credence to that idea, and it was possibly not too far after that, perhaps only a few months or years. So, what about the reel? Well, that was dated to not be used after November of 1970. We also have Lyndon B. Johnson's signature at the end, who was president from November 1963 to January 1969. So by the time this reel aired on Local 58, his term had already expired and Nixon was the next president. It's interesting to note that the expiration date of the reel surpasses the end of Johnson's presidency by nearly 2 years, suggesting that it may not have been something specific to his administration, but a deeper concern that the whole American government had for national security. Now, the first choice for what this deeper concern was is obvious if you know the era of American history we're talking about here, the Cold War. The tensions between the US and Soviet Union were high throughout the second half of the 20th century, especially during this era of the space race, which this seems to take place just after. Now, let's circle back to that strange sentence at the end of the reel. The 51st state is not a place. What is the 51st state? Considering the content of the contingency reel, it's possible that the use of the word state was supposed to invoke a double meaning, both referring to one of the 50 territories that make up the country and a state of being. So it would mean the 51st state was actually the state of death. Basically, it was the reel's final attempt to associate the act of killing yourself with a facet of American nationalism to the bitter end. Now we can discuss what happened after the broadcast of the reel ended, the hoax card. What's very interesting to note is that the hoax card was specifically manufactured in the event of an accidental broadcast for Local 58 specifically. Not only that, but based on the fact that the word hoax is in quotes, this confirms that the contingency reel is not a hoax, but was actually intended to be used for a surrender that did not happen. I have no idea why this card's date is a whole 4.5 years after the reel was meant to be used, though. We can't say for sure whether or not the reel aired on Local 58 after or before its intended expiration, but I think it's certainly likely that it was after. Regardless of when it aired, I find it terrifying to think about what the people serviced by the channel may have done while watching it. Even if it was at 3 in the morning, there's no way not a single person was awake to think that it was real, who may have actually committed the act. All it took was one father awake on the couch while his wife and children slept, taking the message seriously and bringing the whole family down with him. And that is possibly the most horrifying implication this episode brings to the table. This episode's main trope seems to be adjacent to the idea of using a public service announcement in analog horror, though I believe this does it better than almost any other example I've seen within the genre. Obviously, this is only episode 2, but having seen the entire series, I have to say I think this is still the best episode. It's still, 7 years later, one of the best and most terrifying individual episodes of analog horror I've seen. It works so well because it uses only words and simple illustrations to entice your imagination, to put yourself in the situation, to visualize the scenario in your head and realize just how scary of a situation it would be if it were to come to pass. And the reason why this fear works so well, especially for any American, is because government distrust is rampant, and having them pull a stunt like this, especially considering the country's political history and reputation, is a possibility that is more likely than 0%. This is also much less of a thing Local58 specifically established and is a pretty intuitive thing for horror media to do, but the distorted music is what truly sells the atmosphere, and the song choice is also great, choosing to first use an instrumental rendition of the national anthem and then My Country 'Tis of Thee, which is a very American, patriotic song. Definitely appropriate for the manipulation the contingency reel was attempting to enact. Now, one thing you might still be wondering is how it could be possible for this episode to connect to the previous. I mean, surely they must be unrelated. The only commonality between them is the fact that they aired on Local58, right? We'll need to dive deeper in order to find the answer to that question. So, let's move on to the next two, weather service and station ID. This time, the logo and branding is back to what we're familiar with. Per usual, the video opens with a late-night scheduled bumper. The broadcast gets interrupted by an emergency alert, warning the locals about a weather event, effective until sunrise the next morning. It continues advising residents not to look at the event with the naked eye, and then returns to scheduled programming. We then cut forward a bit, most likely by about 2 hours, since the first item on the schedule is now for 2:15 a.m. However, this screen is cut off by yet another warning, this time a civil danger alert. It starts off by saying that the Weather Service is issuing a correction for the weather warning currently in effect. However, the feed glitches and contradicts previous statements, now claiming the meteorological event is safe for all to view and that the warning has been lifted. It then says, "Go outside now." The signal then becomes distorted and text on screen reads, "Can you read this? Look at the moon." And then it says, "Do not look at the moon." And at this rate, it almost feels like two separate forces battling for control over the broadcast, giving out contradicting information regarding a matter of possible life or death. We're told to avoid all windows, face away from mirrors, and to not look up. The feed then returns to the Local58 logo briefly, before another weather warning is issued. "It's in the light. The moon came in. He found me through the mirror. Moonlight white, white like eyes. Not light, but blood. I drown in him. If you are afraid, we will look together." Now, before we move on to the story analysis, I wanted to bundle the next episode with this one, as it came out one day later and is only 18 seconds long. It says, "Analog horror at 476 MHz. We begin our broadcast day. Look away, it does not matter. There are other receivers. Safety in numbers." Weather Service represents a crucial turning point in the series' narrative direction, as we've been introduced to a very mysterious conflict. It seemed as if the Local58 channel was fighting against an outside force hijacking the broadcast, specifically contradicting the warning informing the public of the potential danger in looking at the sky. But what exactly is the problem with looking at the moon anyways? There was seemingly nothing wrong with it when we saw it. However, given the screams heard on the broadcast, there clearly was a problem. As for the identity of the force that interfered with the broadcast, we have no clue. All we do know is that they wanted people to look at the moon, heavily encouraging it, and they spoke in all capitalized letters in contrast to the rest of the text within the video. I also have an interesting fact to share that gives us a bit of extra insight. You see, these first 3 episodes that we've covered all encompass what is categorized as Season 1 of Local58, and they were originally released in the opposite order: Weather Service first, then Contingency, and then you are on the fastest available route. This means that the events in Weather Service were originally meant to be viewed as the starting point for the overall narrative, which I believe tells us that these events are crucial. However, when they were re-uploaded to YouTube, that order was specifically changed. Evidently, this must have been for a reason, unless there literally was no reason, but What that reason might be, I don't know. In regards to station ID, it is basically confirmed this brief entry was a sort of filler episode to signify that the series would continue past what was considered Season 1, which makes sense now that we are aware of its original structure. It's also specifically not included on any of the channel playlists, which all but confirms this. However, the reason why I opted not to disregard it, despite it seemingly not being canon, is because the text and information we see from the text does still have value. The phrase analog horror at 476 MHz is obviously what coined the term analog horror in the first place. That line on its own is a piece of internet history. The frequency 476 MHz is also commonly associated with having been used in the past for public safety announcements, which tonally fits the series and the genre perfectly. The other phrases present in the episode are also important, and they will reappear later on. But for now, without any context, we're going to go ahead and ignore them. Now, the consequences this episode would ripple through the analog horror genre are pretty obvious. The use of the Emergency Alert System, or EAS, is one of the most popular elements of analog horror writing basically ever, and it's for a good reason. When I was a kid, I used to have a hard time falling asleep at night. My parents bought me a little radio for my nightstand so that I could quietly listen to music, which would help me fall asleep when I was struggling. But sometimes in the middle of the night, the station would play a test EAS alert. So whatever I was listening to while I was trying to relax and fall asleep as a child would be abruptly interrupted by this. To little 10-year-old me, that was a mortifying experience, and it always made my heart sink into my stomach. I still, to this day, hate hearing that sound. And that's exactly what makes it work so well. Almost every person living in the United States has heard that tone before. It's specifically designed for that sense of unease and the attentiveness that comes with that, because it's almost always used to preface an important public safety announcement. These days, though, it has certainly become desaturated and is now considered dull and plain to use the trope of the EAS tones. I believe this is not only because of its overuse, but because it's seldom done anywhere near as well as it was in Local58. Alright, I believe that's all I have to say on this one. Let's move on to Season 2's first episode, Show for Children. Show for Children opens with a very 80s retro aesthetic, once again starting with the schedule. Like usual, this is playing in the middle of the night, with a 4:15 a.m. block mirroring the episode's namesake. We then transition to a classic black and white cartoon from 1929, featuring a skeleton named Cadaver in A Grave Mistake. The cartoon begins with Cadaver casually strolling through a graveyard, the moon smiling as it spectates from above, menacingly. Cadaver comes across an open grave and imagines himself a girlfriend that could be waiting for him just below. He checks it out, only to find this. He gets frightened and quickly runs away, and the process repeats, with Cadaver progressively becoming more and more anxious. He finds a strange bird thing, and then the moon's expression changes drastically to a watchful stare. Cadaver then encounters a pit in the next grave, which he finds leads him to an underground cavern. After briefly exploring, he returns to a point from which he came and lies down at the entrance. However, this spot is actually even lower into the cavern, since looking up from the hole just leads to a roof of a different portion in the cave. Perhaps he had found himself incapable of making his way back up the hole, which is a read I make based on his expression. Suddenly we cut back to see the moon shift into view through the hole. And just like that, Cadaver is reduced from an animated character into a real skeleton. his life and will emptied from him. Once again, the moon finds itself at the center of attention. The most obvious thing to point out is the fact that the moon in the cartoon's watching Cadaver the entire time, and even when he looks down the second grave. It's also worth mentioning that Cadaver doesn't look at the moon while he's walking outside, whether this is intentional or not. After he checks the second grave, not only does the moon's expression change, but it also moves to the foreground, which we know because he passes over a tree when he previously did not. This seems to imply that the moon is chasing Cadaver specifically with malicious intent. Obviously, at the end, the moon appears in the cave that he seems to be stuck in, and he gets exactly what he wanted. Cadaver is forced to look at the moon, and something happens to him. I believe the moon may have done the same to those inhabiting the previous graves, including the first skeleton and the strange bird-like thing. The purpose of showing these to us may have been a demonstration of what the moon's strange, almost supernatural influence can have on living beings, both human and animal, the latter of which could explain the creature seen in "You Are on the Fastest Available Route." However, it begs the question, does the moon seek out select creatures to turn into eldritch monstrosities? Surely if it happened to anything that observed it, we'd have a conflict on a scale much larger than a local county TV station. This is unfortunately a question without an answer. I also want to point out that this recording seems to take place sometime in the 80s, with the cartoon allegedly being made in the late 20s. The time slot for the children's show is 4:15 in the morning, and although this isn't explicitly unusual, it still makes you wonder who this cartoon was really made to target. Is this supposed to be like an educational warning? And if that's the case, it implies the knowledge of the moon being dangerous dates far, far back. I struggle to find any significance in the cavern that Cadaver found and later seemingly perished in, and truthfully this episode seems to produce far fewer answers than it does questions. However, I think it's still a valuable and horrifying look into the significance of the moon within the narrative. As far as tropes go, this episode actually uses something very important that would go on to be almost painfully common within analog horror writing. Basically, we're presented with three subjects, usually in increasing levels of disturbing or abstract, ultimately leading to that climactic payoff. This is obviously, once again, not a writing technique Local58 invented, but this instance certainly went on to influence other things. And on a similar note, the episode also utilizes the inherently unnerving juxtaposition created by using a piece of children's media as the basis for something scary. This idea can be traced back much farther than I even want to bother showing, but it's become an awfully popular choice within indie-made horror in the past decade or so, though I can't imagine why. The next episode is titled A Look Back, which is a celebratory compilation of the Local58 channel through different eras, showcasing historical logos, some of which we've seen and others that we have not. However, the signal is interrupted just like before, and we receive a message. We send signals to ourselves through their domain. Did we really believe they wouldn't add their own? From there, some familiar and some unfamiliar clips cycle.
Your destination has moved.
And we get one more statement. Don't touch that dial. More to come. We begin our broadcast day. And just like that, it's already over. This video is very similar to Station ID, being short and not necessarily a canon event that actually happened, yet it still provides us with a load of useful information. Starting from the top, the very first branding for the channel we saw is WCLV, which would later be just a footnote beside Local58. We also learned the exact area this channel services, which is Mason County, West Virginia. Fitting the tone of the series, this is actually the very same county that is home to the legend of the Mothman, one of the most popular cryptids of all time. In the middle, we have the sequence with the strange message, which adds some interesting insight. It says something about sending signals through their domain, once again pointing out a they, identifying this mysterious antagonistic third party. Since the moon is also in the sky and seems to be at the center of this whole mystery, I'd say that in this case, their domain likely refers to the sky, with the signals being radio waves that we use to broadcast television. Them adding their own signals also clarifies that these are in fact external hijackings. The phrase "don't touch that dial" at the end is likely just a reference to old TVs having the dial that changes channels. Basically, it's telling you, don't tune out. This is immediately followed by more to come and thank you for supporting community television. So I assume that this whole thing was just a fourth wall appreciation from the creator. And from a trope perspective, this is pretty much inconsequential, so I have nothing to say that I haven't already discussed. Let's move on to real sleep. This is certainly one of the strangest episodes of the series. It shows us, at first, a 3 p.m. time slot for the program called Real Sleep. And once it begins playing, we briefly see a screen with crucial clarifying information. It states that the video cassette we're about to watch is non-transferable and intended specifically for an individual named Philip Gerhardt. Then we transition to a brief animated sequence introducing the Thought Research Initiative. Next, we learn Real Sleep is an instructional video cassette recorded in 1983, and it is copyrighted through the Thought Research Initiative. It's separated into sections, with section 1 being titled Myth versus Fact. As expected, it goes through some basic statements regarding sleep and dreams, and assigns them a label, myth or fact. The statements dreaming is necessary for regular sleep function and dreams contain symbolism that can predict the future are both fittingly labeled as myths. Sleep allows the body and mind to heal and recover, on the other hand, is labeled as a fact, which should be obvious, right? However, it then follows up by saying that the benefits of sleep are quote-unquote greatly diminished by the frantic, nonsensical images and auditory hallucinations we call dreaming. And it then proceeds to claim dreaming is the vestige of a primitive mind. So, I think we may have just identified an aggressive bias that this research initiative might have. No further clarification is given though, and we move on to section 2. The Kleitman Map. Kleitman maps are described as an index of electric activity in the brain, specifically pinpointing areas burdened by dream stimuli. Once mapped, this activity can be triggered in a controlled manner, and using the inverse of a Kleitman map allows for removing dreams from sleep entirely. No more dreaming. This is what restful, real sleep looks like. Section 3 is the practical portion of the tape, once again clarifying that the procedure is personalized and meant specifically for whoever the tape belongs to. Following this, sequence 1 begins, asking the viewer to focus on the center of the TV. A subtle hum can be heard and a set of blue faces quickly flashes by, landing on one that is clearly doctored. Sequence 2 is titled Cortical Memory, referring to the storage and retrieval of memories. This time, 2 different sets of colored faces flash together, before merging in the center. Then we enter sequence 3, Ablation of Subconscious. We're asked to listen and repeat aloud a phrase, "There are no faces." Meanwhile, many, far more distorted faces than before flash by even quicker, including some things that don't look like faces at all. And suddenly, it stops, and we enter the final sequence. Acceptance. Once sequence 4 completes, the cassette gives us a goodnight farewell, informing us that most patients report dreamless sleep after only one viewing. It also says to consult your technician if results are delayed, or if they have given unwanted side effects. To conclude, it makes absolutely sure to clarify, do not see a doctor. Real sleep almost feels oddly disconnected from the rest of the series. It's hard to make concrete connections between episodes already, considering the anthology-like format. So let's start by unpacking the facts of the broadcast itself. Despite the videocassette claiming to be from 1983 and tailor-made for a specific guy, the logo we see for Local 58 is one of the more modern ones, only put into place decades after the cassette was made. Not only that, but this Real Sleep program is airing at 3 p.m., one of the least likely times anyone would want to be sleeping, and also, it's the very first instance of one of these happening in broad daylight. These facts have a few implications. Number 1, some third party went out of their way to broadcast a cassette meant for a specific guy on a public broadcast. And number 2, the fact that it aired at 3 p.m. means it likely reached a lot of people. At the very least, a lot more than anything that had happened before. Moving on to the contents of the cassette itself, the last name Clayton is a reference to Nathaniel Clayton, regarded as the father of modern sleep science. The rest of the cassette is relatively straightforward, with the Thought Research Initiative having a clear and obvious bias against the idea of dreaming, devolving from a biased instructional cassette into straight-up brainwashing. The first hint of this was in the title for Section 3, Ablation of Subconscious. It uses uncommon vocabulary to try and throw off the average observer, but ablation refers to the removal or destruction of something. In medical terms, it is removal of body tissue or bodily function. It goes on in the final sequence to make it even more obvious, with statements like, "Sleep is not civilized, the mind is a tyrant, stay out of your bedroom, there is work to be done. We are our own gods, the subconscious is a parasite." However, there are also a few even more cryptic lines mixed in, such as, "Your home has another door, and you owe the messenger." Now, this other door thing will come back to be significant later on, but this is where we finally get to identify the overarching parallel, that being the relationship between sleep and the moon. Obviously, most people sleep at night when the moon is present in the sky. Since we've previously established that time and time again some third party is desperately trying to get people to look at the moon, it would make perfect sense for that same force to not only be responsible for the Thought Research Initiative, but also the fact that this was broadcast to an entire county in the middle of the afternoon. To sum it up, we have a brainwashing conspiracy on our hands now. And because the series only showcases its narrative from the perspective of these rogue broadcasts, we have very little idea as to how anyone is reacting to and being affected by all of the things happening here, which makes it all the more terrifying. This episode signifies Local 58's first use of the text on solid color background PSA-type video format showcased commonly within the analog horror medium. This approach became extremely common due to how easy it is to make look at least passably authentic. And I would say that Local 58 wasn't what popularized this, but more likely Gemini Home Entertainment. On top of everything I just described, it also relies heavily on the use of distorted faces to elicit fear, which taps into that uncanny valley. The face at the end of the first sequence is goofy as hell. I will not deny that. But the other genuinely has some really scary things mixed in. The reason why it works is because the line "there are no faces" is kind of straight up true. None of the faces in sequence 3 are arranged correctly, but our brains kind of just automatically associate them as faces. As I'm sure you all know, the idea of using distorted faces has plagued analog horror on such a vast scale, with mediocre execution after mediocre execution, that it's one of the only things that it's remembered for by the general public these days. But to be quite honest, I think it's pretty well done here. Well, I've run out of things to say about Real Sleep, so let's go ahead and move on to Season 2's finale, Skywatching. This time, Local 58 is sporting the branding that came right before the one that we're most familiar with, most likely being their 90s aesthetic. The bumper shows a slot for Skywatching at 12 a.m. and a city council meeting recorded on October 30th, 1991. The logo for the program shows the host's name is Hank Heidemann, but the animated logo gets interrupted and replaced with familiar, capitalized red text. Afterwards, we're guided through two famous constellations, with the brightness and contrast being adjusted to give us a better view. Then we see the moon, labeled as his throne. The observer uses the recorder's zoom to capture the surface in more detail, which appears very different from what we would expect from the moon, having an almost organic surface texture. At one point, there even seems to be a breeze or wind on the surface of the moon, which is impossible because it has no substantial atmosphere. We cut to several different angles, showing off the strange appearance of the moon, before we eventually see a spot with clearly unnatural architecture, with a giant triangle-like shape carved into the ground. But only a few seconds later, the clouds cover the view of the moon. And then suddenly, rejoice. And the program ends, showing us a photo of Earth from the moon. Let's start off this section with a crucial clarification. The events of this episode are not the same as those in Weather Service. We know this to be true because the footage of Skywatching was published in 1994, but the EAS warnings in Weather Service happened live, while the channel branding was newer. Obviously, this means that two similar meteorological events happened, both in Skywatching and Weather Service, separated by probably about 10 or 15 years. Now, what about the contents of the program itself? Per analog horror fashion, it starts out relatively normal despite the immediate implication that the broadcast is being relayed by our mysterious third party. It's possible that the moon itself is not the problem, but perhaps it is rather what is inside of, or what inhabits the moon. It could be that the moon is simply a vessel, the throne for a royal hymn that is referred to. When Hank zooms in on the moon, we see a lot of things unfamiliar to our perception of the moon. Strange surface texture and architecture, and the impossible implication of wind. Then something happens that we may have actually already had established precedents for before. The moon seemingly gets several times larger in the sky and alarms blare. But let's talk about that first part, the moon getting bigger. What if it didn't actually get bigger, it just got closer? In fact, this is exactly what happened in the cartoon in Show for Children. I think it's also worth noting that this footage was produced by a local group from Mason County in cooperation with a group known as the Civil Broadcasting Authority. This begs the question though, is this a blatant confirmation that the federal government is in on all this? Well, let's think about it. We know for a fact the moon landing happened. This screen is literally a picture of the Earth taken from the surface of the moon. And we know that just before it happened, the government put in place contingency policies should they ever fall to an impossibly powerful threat. The federal government has an idea of what is going on. How and why did the moon get closer? Why does the moon appear to be different from ours, even containing what seems like the skeleton of some titanic eldritch being? And most strangely, why does Hank Heidemann set down the camera to worship the moon? The most logical answer, in my opinion, is that the being inside the moon is what's actually causing all of the conflict we've seen thus far. The third party that has been hijacking Local58 is a cult doing its bidding, as they are clearly acting on behalf of something and not serving themselves. This group refers to this being with these royal male pronouns, like him, and they seem to treat it as a royal deity as well, which explains their evidently cult-like dedication. A part of me really struggles to believe that all of this is being done willingly, though. The cult likely originated from the moon exercising its influence onto them. We even have hints as to why Hank, well, left the camera and rejoiced in front of the moon. First of all, Hank is clearly viewing the phenomenon occurring in the sky through the lens of his camera. He doesn't get up until he adjusts the brightness and contrast exactly in such a way that he can see the thing on the moon that's clearly not supposed to be there. Not only that, but it isn't always there. Somehow, the moon has the ability to willingly choose when to present itself in this way. Based on what we were told in Weather Service, it seems like the moon's influence mainly comes from the moonlight, and it found the messenger in Weather Service through the mirror. It's possible that the moonlight is only strong enough to do this if it gets close enough, which would explain why nothing happens until the moon specifically decides to get closer. This is exactly what happened to Cadaver in the cartoon as well. Aside from that, though, there's not much for us to unravel here. However, we may have some luck diving into a separate rabbit hole which was discovered in September of 2021, a whole 2 years after Skywatching was posted. Let's take a gander at the Local58 website. Although many details of this ARG or alternate reality game are lost as the website has been updated over time, thankfully the entire game thus far has been documented extensively on the Game Detectives wiki, which I will be referencing throughout this section. Thank you to everyone who contributed to that page. On September 13th, 2021, Easter eggs were found on the Local58.tv website. At the bottom of the page was the text, Copyright 2021, Thought Research Initiative LLC, with no further elaboration. What this does tell us, though, is that that project is ongoing through to the modern day, having lasted nearly 4 decades at the bare minimum. There was also a server string on the page that looked like this. Of particular note is the use of the word apogee, defined as the point in the orbit of the moon or a satellite at which it is furthest from the Earth. The word server in this string was also clickable, leading to a link titled local58.tv/1244790000. This number is actually a Unix timestamp, Unix being a form of time measurement that counts every second forward from January 1st, 1970 at 12 a.m. UTC. The date in question? June 12th, 2009, the day the real-world FCC mandated the switch from analog to digital broadcasting format. 10 days later, on September 23rd, the homepage updated to display this banner, clearly a parody of the Wayback Machine. 10 seconds after opening the page, users were directed to local58.tv/null, which revealed this article, The Era of Home Recording. Based on the logo seen in the bottom image, we can intuit that this was from around the 60s and 70s, which aligns with what it actually talks about, describing magnetic tape and advertising the first commercial recording systems. However, the very last paragraph is contextually unrelated to the rest of the article, instead saying, "Before the gilded doorsill of our master's silent house, we lift our mortal eyes along its wide forgotten stair and fix them thereupon an empty throne." In the bottom right corner, the TV static hides a QR code. When cleaned and scanned, it yields the following sentence: "A predator cannot differentiate prey from accomplice." A week later, September 30th rolls around, and the Era for Home Recording newspaper clipping is redacted and replaced with this. Then, 1 week later, a new link appears on the Look Back timeline, allowing us to see a version of the website from 1999. Although many of the links and elements are broken, we can navigate to a page that shows us a scanned document titled Vestigial Low Band Filter. Most of the information on this document is fairly benign. It describes this device being used for protection against unwanted picture interference. That sounds familiar. The last passage gives us a better idea of the context through which this was used as well, reading, "Do not attempt to repair the vestigial low band filter. Total replacement of the unit is covered by all standard warranties. Tampering with the vestigial low band filter is forbidden by law." Like before, this document contained its own hidden QR code, which when deciphered and scanned would yield the following phrase: "Parasite is to host as inhabitant is to environment." I'm not quite sure what the significance of this equivalence is, but I believe there is special intent in showing us the correlation between parasite and host. Now, so far, the only thing in the series that has ever been referred to as a parasite is the subconscious back in real sleep. So if that's the connection we're meant to make, then what about the other half? I believe it may be trying to steer us towards the idea that the moon is not the problem, it's what's inside of the moon. Inhabitant to environment. Though there is more, and this is not the end of the ARG on the website, the rest of it would come after a major upload on the channel several weeks later, on Halloween. So, without further ado, let's take a look at digital transition. Contrary to what we've come to expect, digital transition does not actually start with a schedule bumper, but instead with an episode of an old TV show. On the bottom is a scrolling banner informing viewers that Local58 is making the switch to digital broadcasting tonight at midnight, directing people to their website for more information. The movie ends and the credits roll, being directed by a man named John Newman. By surely complete coincidence, that last name in German translates to New Moon. Then we transition back to Local58 for a goodbye analog farewell program. It informs that the switch will occur on midnight, July 13th, 2021, and goes on to say anyone with older television sets will have their service interrupted. However, those with them are redirected to see if they qualify for a free digital conversion kit on the Local58 website. 30 seconds before midnight, a compilation begins to play showing us the exact timeline of Local58's branding. At the very end, a brand new, modern Local58 logo is premiered for the transition into the digital age, lining up with more modern company aesthetics. Once the clock strikes 12, the signal begins to die out before giving way entirely to static. However, it then returns. Although it's quite dark, text can be seen reading Local58 announcement. This station will not be participating in digital conversion at this time. Though as soon as it appears, it vanishes, replaced by an error screen, and before long, the audio and video feed corrupt, and we receive an outside transmission once more. Unthinking they move, to cut his throat, only to make 1,000 mouths. If he is silenced, we will speak for him. Signs and wonders flood our little sky. No stars above us, only eyes waiting to open. There are other receivers. Finally, it ends with a federal warning screen advising against interception of previously used analog signals. And that's it. Up until this point, the furthest we had ever seen anything happen in Local58 was 2014, the very first episode. Now we've jumped all the way to 2021, which is cool and all, but why specifically 2021? In our world, the FCC federally mandated the digital transition all the way back on June 12, 2009. The digital transition was put off several times. In fact, while full power broadcasting stopped on June 12, 2009, like I mentioned, a lot of low power broadcasting kept going until July 13th, 2021. So, although it's less interesting than the idea of foul play, obviously we're being led to believe that Local58 was never a full power broadcasting station and it simply went out much later. But even if everything lines up with the real dates, it doesn't necessarily have to have been for the same reason. After all, there is clearly a lot of weird stuff happening here. For example, let's take a look at the screen at the end of the video. This isn't just a normal federal warning, it has the logo for the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, and the Department of Health and Human Services, and also the FCG, which is similar to our FCC. What could the G even stand for? Well, perhaps it's something like the Federal Communications Guard. After all, the only US government department with a G in its acronym is the United States Coast Guard. At around 2 minutes and 43 seconds, there's a poem that can be faintly seen in the background. which reads, "I the one you watched, I the always here. They make you thought from pieces. They cut the thoughts I am. All knife, all knife. Thoughts shape in needles. They dream themselves in knives." This seems to relate to the other message that we see within the entry. The mentioned knives could represent the literal cut off of the analog signal only to make 1,000 mouths. It goes on to say, if he is silenced, we will speak for him. Now we know for sure that these are two separate parties. In all honesty, it seems like all they managed to do was piss off the moon. I believe this whole thing was a warning that analog signal may never have been their only option to broadcast their message. In the digital age, information spreads much faster, like through the internet. Digital transition represents a crucial turning point in the series, where for the first time it has dipped into the newer and perhaps now more popular genre of digital horror. The transition from analog to digital formatting echoes the tropes of lost media, and the different logos flashing by with the dates capitalize on nostalgia. Both of these things are arguably the most popular tropes within digital horror, and now they've made their way all the way back to the original analog horror. How ironic that the circle of inspiration made a total 360. And now we can return to the website for a brief final exploration. We can start off by typing in the link from Digital Transition, which is local58.tv/digital. The link brings us to a glitched page, likely designed with the purpose of informing the public about how they can set up a digital converter box, if they still have an analog TV set. At the bottom, the eligibility for a free kit is reiterated, including a phone number that we can call. This phone number returns Morse code, which when translated, simply says once more, "There are other receivers." 2 days after Digital Transition released, 2 new links were added to the Look Back timeline, dated January 9th, 2001 and March 17th, 2001. Although the first of these 2 links yields an internal server error with nothing of note, the second presents us with a more complete picture of what the Local58 website used to look like when compared to the 1999 archive. At the bottom of the page are 6 images under the header "All Your Favorites," showing 2 frames of the Local58 channel, Vintage and Modern, and 4 programs: Public Eye, Skywatching with Hank Heidemann, Late Movie, and Still Life. Nothing else can be gleaned from this specific page. However, people discovered soon after the image paths of these programs could be used to locate alternative images on the 1999 archive. The first of these, 990s.jpg, showcases a glitched version of a transcribed conversation from March 22nd, 2007. It seems to be a conversation regarding broadcast protocol, and it mentions the Civil Broadcasting Authority as well. At the end, the 2 individuals seem to be coming up with a plan to track down stations that have still refused to adopt the new protocol, saying that they can pull records of their equipment and see who's furthest behind. The next 2 images, latemov.jpg and p_i.jpg, seem to be distorted faces that we can't quite make out. Funnily enough, skywatch.jpg is the only one that remains completely unchanged. And next we have stilllife.jpg, which is a scan of a newspaper article. This particular newspaper dates back to the early 80s and seems to be significant for containing the announcement of In the Public Eye, becoming a weekly feature of amateur and professional local photography. This also teaches us the newspaper is called The Observer. Because we know this weekly feature would become a recurring favorite show on Local58 in the future, we can likely infer that the newspaper and Local58 channel were both made by either the local government or a local company that dates back to at least the early 20th century. The next article describes how historical buildings in the town square are set to be demolished despite cultural importance. The reason why this is interesting is because it also goes on to say that the WCLV TV station and broadcasting tower for Local58 are just a block away from where these abrupt and seemingly illogical demolitions are planned to take place. Finally, we have broadcastday.jpg, which originally showcased the late 60s, early 70s era Local58 branding with a low opacity photo of the moon landing overlaid in the background. But the alternative version redirects us to a video titled NSSA-3 Atypical. The contents of this video are practically unintelligible, consisting entirely of static, distortion, and strange tones and rumbles in the audio. Despite my own and many others' best efforts to decipher spectrograms or in any way, shape, or form glean any information from the audio, to this day, 3.5 years later, nobody has a clue what this video means. And as of now, that is the end of the Local58 ARG. Let's move on to our next entry, Close. Close opens on the modern Local58 channel, labeling itself as a special presentation. We see a countdown for live stream starting, and we get some elaboration on what's going on. Close stands for Cometary Lander Orbiter Survey Expedition, and the mission in question is specifically to a celestial body named 57838 Eidolon. Once there is about a minute remaining, the feed skips forward that remaining minute and the stream begins. A new timer appears, estimating about 26 minutes to landing, and we can hear unintelligible radio communications on the stream audio. The rest of the stream is essentially just footage of the camera getting closer to Eidolon, periodically interrupted with important supplementary information. The first of these interruptions tells us it was discovered in 2006 and describes how its surface details are difficult to discern. We also learned that the comet looks like a face or skull during certain points in its rotation due to shadows cast on the terrain. A few minutes later, we see some photographs taken from Earth to confirm this fact, the first of which being from June of 2008 by the Arecibo Astrophotography Society. The second is an amateur photo taken 8 years later in 2016 by Angela Gerhardt. The copyright tells us this stream must have taken place at least in 2022. After that revelation, we see a render of the Close orbiter and lander before once again returning to amateur photos, this time from New Year's Eve 2017. There were a few more arbitrary fun facts sprinkled in as well, including the fact that Eidolon is apparently classified as potentially hazardous, but not until a whole 5 centuries from now. At around 10 minutes till landing, we're shown the fourth photo, taken on May 19, 2020, by Hank Heidemann. Now with less than 10 minutes remaining, the camera grows ever closer to the comet, and yeah, it really does look like a skull, doesn't it? At around 7 minutes, we're shown a cast shadow simulation to showcase exactly how that happens, which is pretty interesting. But then we get a totally unnecessary artist rendition of what it would look like if it were an actual skull? I don't understand the point of this. Finally, we get one more false contrast image of Eidolon from February 4th, 2022. Over the next few minutes, the camera closes in as it approaches the landing spot, the ambient audio gradually becoming louder and louder and the tension building up. The video feed also starts to glitch, making the visuals slightly unclear. Within the last 2 minutes, the shadows begin to illuminate, revealing a previously unaccounted for hole. And in that hole is a door. The lander successfully touches down right next to the door. The door opens, and the lander is violently flung off the comet and into deep space. Maybe that artist was onto something. This is a bit of a strange one. I already mentioned most of what was important during the actual run-through of the video, but there's a few things of note that I didn't. Firstly, the name Eidolon, which was assigned to the comet, refers to a specter or phantom, so a ghost, basically. Given its appearance, this does make sense, and I'm not sure if the given name has any meaning beyond that. I'm also not sure if the appearance of the comet is a coincidence or not, which, at least the narrative the video is spinning is that it is a coincidence and that it just happens to be shaped like a skull. We have seen skulls in the series before, of course, but again, can't quite tell if that matters. It's also definitely important to point out the reappearance of 2 names, Hank Heidemann from Skywatching and Angela Gerhardt, who shares the last name with Philip Gerhardt from The Real Sleep Cassette. We have no reason to believe either of these recurrences are anything but odd references, but it's interesting that Hank Heidemann is alive and well, despite what seemed to happen to him nearly 3 decades prior. It raises a lot of questions we don't have answers. I also wanted to highlight that the video and audio distort over time as the camera nears the comet, which could imply some sort of signal interference, which would be in line with what has happened throughout the series. And then of course there's the matter of the door. I can't possibly hope to explain why a random comet has a giant door on it, but this isn't the first time we've seen impossible architecture on a celestial body. This also isn't the first time we've had doors mentioned in the series. It happened exactly once, and I said earlier that it would be important again. My guess is that this door has to be directly related to what happened with the moon in some way. Obviously, it should draw back to the central conflict, but it's too vague to really say much more than that. The final episode thus far opens with our first schedule bumper in the modern day, teasing a 10 p.m. showing of a 1977 show titled Night Walk. And instead, we see camcorder footage.
Hey. Excuse me. Are you alright?
Once again, we find the phrase repeated: a predator cannot differentiate between prey and accomplice. Safety in numbers. Nightwalk may not seem like much, but it establishes a very important connection that previously had been missing. In the very first episode, the conflict comes to a climax with the appearance of the strange cryptid-like creature that assaults the person in the vehicle. Now we once again explore the idea of a strange cryptid or monster showing up, this time dating all the way back to 1961, and more specifically, June 13th, the same day the digital transition occurred. Unlike the original appearance of a strange being, this time it's directly connected to the moon, shown to always be looking towards it, particularly at twilight. And speaking of twilight, this interaction we see towards the end takes place during that time, but it doesn't actually make sense. We're told the footage is captured at 7:30 p.m., but the sun does not set at this time in November. In fact, it sets much earlier, even as soon as between 4:30 and 5 p.m. Whether or not this is a mistake or is intentional, I can't say for sure, but if it's not a mistake, it could have something to do with the moon's ability to become closer and larger in the sky, generating more light. One last thing you may have missed: after the passing car lights up the silhouette to reveal its true nature, the person panics and the camera turns around to freeze at a random white structure, which was not only right behind the individual, but probably came out of nowhere. This looks to me like it may be a door, and it looks like the door found on the comet Eidolon. However, this one we see only closed. Finally, of course, we have these two titular phrases repeated at the very end before the footage abruptly cuts off. We still don't really know what either of these are referring to. I believe that they may be phrases that will continue to appear quite frequently, leading up to a payoff that explains to us what they mean. But for now, it must remain, as most of the details in this series are, utterly shrouded in mystery. Now that we've gone through every available element to the story thus far, I figured I'd attempt to put a timeline together, just as a recap for anyone who might have gotten lost along the way, and to have a comprehensive place where everything is in order. This section is going to be mostly unscripted, so we'll see how that goes. According to real history, 1804 was the year that Mason County, West Virginia was founded. And we jump forward by quite a bit after that to 1929, which is when the A Grave Mistake cartoon was made by Thimble Pictures, and this showcases the suspicious nature of the moon as early as 1929, which I believe is an important detail, because it means that people knew about it way before most of the series events take place. In 1938, the Mason County local broadcast WCLV-TV is founded. In 1954, the Local58 branding is added to WCL-TV. With 1961, we have the woman in profile urban legend appearing for the first time specifically on June 13th. In 1963, 2 years later, this is when Lyndon B. Johnson is elected as president, and under his administration, the creation of the contingency reel would occur. And the contingency reel must have been accidentally broadcasted between 1969 and 1976. We know it has to be at minimum 1969 because the moon landing is featured, meaning it must have already happened. And we know it cannot be any further than 1976 because this is approximately the time in which the channel branding changes, which is why I have these ranges for the date. In 1977, we have Nightwalk making their segment on Woman in Profile, and it says that between 1961 and 1977, there have been at least 24 sightings, meaning at least 24 sightings, so who knows how many of them happened between that time and 1996, when we actually see the camcorder footage. Now, this next one is actually kind of vague. I just put 198X. This is when the Observer, the newspaper, notes that the unexpected demolition of buildings near the Local 58 broadcast tower is set to happen as soon as in 1982. Now we can jump to 1983, which is when the Thought Research Initiative distributes the Real Sleep cassette for Philip Gerhardt's use, but obviously this wouldn't be aired until quite a bit after that. In 1994, Skywatching with Hank Heidemann, at least the specific episode that we see is recorded, and between 1994 and 2002, the broadcast actually happens, and we know that once again because of the dates where the branding changes. In 1996, this is when the Woman in Profile legend is identified as a strange anomalous creature, and in 1999, this is when I believe the Local 58 website to be created. Between 2002 and 2011, this is very, very vague because it just basically comes down to the channel branding. This is when Weather Service has to take place, and this is when Real Sleep actually gets broadcast publicly on Local 58. Jumping to 2006, we have asteroid 57838 Eidolon being discovered for the first time, and in 2007 we have that commentary from the ARG regarding equipment records, and the Civil Broadcast Authority is mentioned. Then we have 2008, this is when Eidolon is photographed by the Arecibo Astrophotography Society. Then obviously June 2009, this is when the full power broadcast stations were forced by the FCG or whoever to convert to digital signals. 2014 is when the first episode takes place, where an individual seems to maybe die on a road trip when their GPS is influenced, at least that's what appears to happen. And that's also when we have that other cryptid creature that seems to be possibly related to the Woman in Profile urban legend, though I do not believe it is the same creature. In 2016, we have Eidolon being photographed by Angela Gerhardt, which is the daughter, most likely, of Philip Gerhardt. Then 2017, it's photographed by the North American Comet Watch. And then if the ARG takes place in universe, it would be between 2019 and 2021. Most likely. In 2020, Eidolon is photographed by Hank Heidemann, which is the host of Skywatching. As we know, it means that whatever happened to him in Skywatching, the video, he doesn't die, at the very least. He does live to take the photograph of Eidolon much later. Then 2021 is when Local58 seems to reluctantly transition to digital broadcasting. Also in 2021, we have the Thought Research Initiative renewing their copyright all the way from at least 1983, if not earlier, which is many decades of this strange research initiative that we don't know much about. Then finally, at least in 2022, it could take place after 22, we have the Closed mission, which somehow discovers a door on the comet Eidolon, and this is broadcast live as a special presentation on the Local58 channel. And as far as I know, for now, that's as far as we go. So just to kind of bring it all together, I want to ask an all-encompassing question. What exactly is going on in the world of Local58? In simple terms, I think this is a cosmic horror story. The moon, or whatever it is this all-powerful entity to overcome, or maybe even fall to by the end of the story, and there's this secret cult that have made their devotion to furthering its cause extremely apparent throughout the series. I think this group is directly responsible for the hijackings that were enough of a known issue to make their way into federal law and legislation, and I also believe this group is directly responsible for the ongoing experiments conducted by the Thought Research Initiative, because the goals of the Thought Research Initiative are directly related to the goals of the cult. The two strange creatures that we see are certainly related to this eldritch being in some way, but we don't know what purpose they serve for it quite yet. Similarly, the federal government's role in this whole thing is unclear, but this much can be said for sure. They are at least vaguely aware of the threat looming above, and something was able to scare the American government so much that they put together that ultimate contingency that we saw just in episode 2 of the series. We also have that cartoon made all the way back in 1929 to point to showcasing the moon's antagonistic nature far before any moon landing would have provided that information. So either Thimble Productions knows some crazy shit that nobody else did at the time, or the moon landing was a disguise for a crucial investigation of a threat that the government already knew about. And I think this makes perfect sense, because Lyndon Johnson's presidency ends a few months before the moon landing, but the contingency was made under his administration, which means they had to have known of the danger before they actually went onto the moon to do a full investigation. There are also several other organizations at play as well, such as the FCG and the CBA, and the FCG seems to be the federal organization responsible for mandating the switch to digital broadcasting. Not sure why they're two separate things, honestly. The ongoing theme throughout this series is definitely the aforementioned signal interference phenomenon. Even in the very first episode, the core conflict was that the GPS had its signal hijacked. The federal government likely focused on the TV broadcast hijackings because they were the most evident and probably reached the most people and caused the most problems. Whatever, right? This is especially true in Contingency when a literal government leak is aired, which probably caused some people to maybe murder their own families. That's no good. So what's the government gonna focus on? Making sure that they switch to digital signals so that interference is more difficult. But here's the problem. Did that even work? I want to remind you of what was said in Digital Transition. Unthinking they move to cut his throat, only to make 1,000 mouths. If he is silenced, we will speak for him. Signs and wonders flood our sky. No stars, only eyes, waiting to open. There are other receivers. So, what if the eyes in the sky they're referring to here are satellites? GPS uses satellite-based signals, and we see evidence from the very beginning that these signals can also be interfered with. Every satellite, TV, and radio is clearly an issue. So what stops phones from being an issue? Are cell towers somehow exempt from this? What even makes a digital signal safer? I think I know the answer they were trying to give us. It isn't safer, because everything is a receiver. Or at least, that's what I think. But what do I know, right? Obviously, there's some other things like the safety in numbers and Predator cannot differentiate that I can't really think of a satisfying theory for what either of those really mean yet. I think we just don't have enough context. Despite Local58's origins being a decade old, it is still an ongoing mystery. Naturally, this story just doesn't have much in terms of payoffs or satisfying conclusions, and it's always going to be difficult to put together a puzzle when you don't have all the pieces. And really, who says it has to be a linear narrative, a simple puzzle to be solved? Local58 has always presented itself as an anthology. We are only getting a glimpse into this world from the perspective of some random broadcast station. There's clearly much more to it than we could ever imagine. But regardless, I had a lot of fun revisiting this iconic series after so many years. Despite the long gaps between releases, hopefully this video renewed your interest in or introduced you to the monstrous world Kris Straub has crafted for our enjoyment. I think Local58 is pretty damn cool. If you're watching this, Kris, take your time, man. Your work's awesome. And if you enjoyed your time listening to me yap for, let's see, almost an hour and a half now, I'd recommend checking out my videos on other topics you might find interesting, ranging from other internet horror to indie game lore, and hopefully more variety coming in the future. So anyways, that's gonna be all from me. I hope you enjoyed the video. Until next time.